Taking a look live there at the Capitol, the flags flying at half-staff in honor of one of the staff members of Gabrielle Giffords, who was killed in this shooting. Of course, federal judge also died, and 4 others. About this shooting, it's time for our Sunday group. Britt Hume, Fox News senior political analyst, Mara Eliason of National Public Radio, Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Britt, your thoughts on the shooting and the fallout?
Horrible thing. Disturbing, even a little depressing. You hear the prescriptions now beginning to be suggested as to how we might address this. Better security for congressional members. I suppose that would help. You're hearing, remarks about the nature of American discourse. It's way too early to know what effect American discourse of any kind had on someone who appears, from all accounts, to be quite deranged. I would say we inhabit an open society, where public officials mingle openly and pretty freely with their constituents and others. And I think this is part of the risks of democracy. And it's a remarkable thing, really, when you see how exposed members of Congress and other officials are to the public, that there isn't more of this sort of thing. This is a case where, as it happens every now and then in America, somebody goes on a murderous shooting rampage. That's what appears to have happened here.
Mara, Britt says it's too early to talk about the political discourse. It's already being talked about.
That doesn't mean people aren't doing it. That's right. I think it is too early to know whether there was any connection between political discourse and what happened. I mean, the guy sounds like he was really deranged. He had voices in his head. He rambled on his website. He had views that you could call left and views you could call right. He probably was so extreme. He was in that spot on the political spectrum where the extreme left and the extreme right meet.
Circle.
But but that being said, there is already, unfortunately, a lot of blame being slung around. I think a conversation about whether political discourse in this country has gone too far, in some cases, is a really good one to have. That doesn't mean that it's the cause of what happened in Arizona. But I think it would be better for political discourse if people didn't call each other fascists and socialists and Nazis and Hitler, and if gun sights weren't put on people's districts. I mean, that would probably be better. Whether it would have prevented anything that happened yesterday is not clear.
Bill.
Well, as Britt said, it is disturbing and depressing, and I guess one always focuses on the victims, obviously, as one should, and they're in our prayers, and also on the killer, who's obviously a deranged person. But it's also worth noting in this case, as in so many other American tragedies, there also were acts of heroism. I mean, and it's worth saying that because this is in a country of 300 million people, there will be deranged killers, unfortunately. There will also be people who rise to the occasion. A 20-year-old intern, Daniel Hernandez, who worked in the district office of Congresswoman Giffords, was manning the event and working, I think, at the table where the people were checking in. When the shots rang out, he ran over to her. Helped other people actually attend to the other victims. I guess he knew something about emergency medical care, and attended to Congresswoman Giffords, staunch the bleeding at least enough that apparently the doctors say he saved her life, accompanied her to the hospital, and this is a 20-year-old kid who showed incredible poise and courage. And
you hear, Juan, about the 9-year-old girl who was brought to the event by a neighbor because she was at the student council, just elected.
To learn about how government works.
Yeah. Your thoughts on the whole thing?
Well, obviously, as everyone has said, this is a horrific event, and this is the kind of thing that just chills you and makes you worry about a free and open government. And, of course, our government relies on the idea that you can speak to your elected leaders and tell them what you think. But it doesn't mean that you should be free to attack people. Now, to get to the quick summations that people are rushing to here, and I think it's important to say this as someone left of center, that, you can't just blame this on some kind of right-wing rhetoric. I mean, clearly, I think this kid was unstable. Now, there are connections between him and this group, American Renaissance, I believe they're called, and they are strongly anti-immigrant, they're anti-Semitic, and they're anti-government. So I think that there is the temptation to say, oh, this is the result of right-wing attacks. But, my sense is that let's wait a second, and let's make sure about any kind of connections. If you go back to '95 in Oklahoma City bombing, there were people who said it was actually to the benefit of Democrats at that time and helped the country to become more supportive of President Clinton when he attacked the right wing for their kind of vitriol at that time. I would hope that people aren't so base as to make this into a political debate at this moment. I do have worries about Arizona. I think the sheriff down there said it yesterday when he said that There's too much of this kind of anti-immigrant fervor going on in Arizona. It's become home, some people call it the new Birmingham, because of the intolerance that's demonstrated in much of the state. And I think that people in Arizona have to stop for a second and think about exactly why they are so angry and why this incident happened in Arizona.
What's next here, Britt? President Obama obviously sent his FBI director, Robert Mueller, there. He met with his national security team. We saw the pictures of that yesterday. We saw him calling all of these officials. What's next, and how do you think this administration handles this going forward?
Well, obviously he's got the head of the FBI out there. That places a certain obvious, extraordinary priority on the investigation and on the case. Presumably in the days ahead we will learn more about exactly the chain of events that happened and exactly what the course of this young man's life was that led him to this hideous day. And no doubt there's going to be a wave of attempts to blame this on the character, the national discourse, the political atmosphere in Arizona. The sheriff popping off that Juan thought was so well said yesterday, I thought was extremely premature and unwise of him to say that. It seems to me that when somebody who obviously has more than one screw loose does something as insane as this and as violent and brutal, that attributing it to any kind of coherent political philosophy is a stretch, and that we do well not to go there.
But Britt, wouldn't you say that, in fact, in this era of Obama, that a lot of the things that are said about politicians, and especially in the course of the health care discussion and the shouting at the Congress, don't you think that things have become a little bit more angry in our times? Wouldn't that be fair to say? And that's why I think that there's some who, I agree with you, have this base instinct to try to make political hay out of this.
Well, what I would say, I think people are trying to make political hay out of it, but not perhaps in the way you suggest. All of these things we're beginning to hear now, pinning responsibility on right-wing radio show hosts and others, were the same things that we heard back at the time of the Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing. We've heard all this before. We've been through this cycle before. That didn't ever really lead anywhere or establish
And you don't
anything.
think things are a little bit higher in terms of the tenor at this moment in American political life?
On the lunatic fringe, they're always high, and they obviously were high in this case.
Bill, what about the decision by House Republican leadership to put off the repeal vote on Wednesday as a result of this tragedy? I asked the Congresswoman about that, shifting the schedule.
Well, I guess they're just putting off all the votes and the business of the House for a week, and I suppose that's a reasonable thing. It's probably a reasonable thing to do in light of the shock of this, and a Congresswoman being critically wounded and her staff member being killed, and I wouldn't second guess it. They'll have to get back to work. I mean, and obviously people will have to vote the way they think is right for the country, and I don't think this will end up having, honestly, much political effect. I think that's a kind of, it assumes that the voters really are, I mean, the voters have their views about what the healthcare system should be, or whether we should fight the war in Afghanistan or not, and the idea that they're going to change their minds because of a terrible attack by a deranged young man on a congresswoman is not going to affect things one way or the other.
I do think it's going to make people think twice before they use certain metaphors in politics, like fascist, socialist,
right.
Nazis. I mean, I think people are going to have to think, not because this kind of rhetoric caused it, but I think it is going to have a kind of cautionary and positive effect.
Does it change this?
Let me draw one line of distinction. If you want to call someone a fascist, that's one thing. I think that's obviously over the top. Fascism is not abroad in the land. Nazis, similarly. But if you want to argue that someone's a socialist, there are people on Capitol Hill who are declared socialists, Maura. That's nothing wrong with that.
But the kinds of things that we would defend our country using military means against. Some people would defend our country against communists and socialists using military.
Last word quickly, Juan. Does this change how lawmakers interact with their constituents? Does security change? Does this dynamic change because of this incident?
Well, yesterday I had a conversation just by coincidence in a mall with a congresswoman. And she said to me, of course, that, she's not going to be exposed in this way and that she wants more security. So I would imagine she's not singular in her views. I just heard your interview with the two, and both of them are talking about this as well, putting more money into security. You know what? I understand their need for security, but it's not a good thing in terms of diminishing the amount of contact. And I think Bill's shaking his head. We agree. You got to be able to talk to your congressman and say, I disagree.
We will leave it there. Panel, we have to take a break here.